All right, today's stories are all about people making very confident decisions and then immediately regretting them. We've got landlords who thought they knew the law better than the actual law, a manager who tried to fix overtime by pretending problems would just disappear, and a company that took things way too far and ended up paying for it literally. Each one starts with someone pushing a little too hard and ends with them realizing they picked the wrong hill to stand on. Let's get into it. My lead slacked off, someone screwed up, and I refused to take the fall. I was 17 working at a big theme park and had been working there for the better part of the year. I quickly picked things up and was usually regarded as the responsible one on the team when it was just a bunch of us teens working a ride. We had a college student intern lead who was not good at leading or training new hires. We'll call him M. At my main ride, it required 3 people minimum to operate. 1 person in the control booth, 1 at the entrance gate, and 1 at the exit. However, we could have 4 or 5 if we were incredibly busy to help deal with the line. The people in the booth and at the entrance couldn't see the person at the exit directly, so we used radios. The control booth also had a camera on the exit gate. From day one on the job, we were taught hand signals in case the radio dies or for quick communication. These signals were universal across the entire park. That summer, 3 freshly certified kids, we had to take tests to prove we paid attention to training, started the ride with someone locked inside the fence, aka not in a seat. Twice it was another employee, once it was a guest, which was a huge deal. The thing with those incidents was that those in the control booth didn't notice their mistake until the others screamed at them to hit the e-stop. Those new hires were either retrained or moved to a simpler ride. Well, one incredibly busy day, there were 5 of us running things, me, M, and 3 others. M had been called over to another ride, which normally wasn't an issue. About an hour later, someone was scheduled to go home, and M hadn't come back yet. I called the other ride and asked them to send him back. We could have run things with 3 of us, but it was super busy, and we really needed a 4th. A few minutes later, someone, not our lead, was sent over to take over. Weird, but no big deal. Another hour or so went by. Someone else needed to go home. I called again asking for M. Also, all the radio's batteries were dead or dying. Things had slowed down, so I, being the spare 4th person, took the radios to the office to get fresh batteries. This took less than 10 minutes, and in that time, the guys had switched to hand signals as we were trained. When I came back, our lead had once again sent over someone else to take his spot. At this point, I realized that M was probably just shooting the crap in the nice air-conditioned booth at the other ride. Now, the guy that got sent over to us was normally at a roller coaster and hadn't been at this ride in over a month, so I gave him a quick review and he took controls. I turned around for maybe 30 seconds when I hear yelling. I turned around and the ride was stopped maybe 3 feet off the ground with our entrance guy locked in the fence. The guy at controls saw what he did and hit the e-stop, something that the other screw-ups that summer didn't think to do. We had to call upper management, and wouldn't you know, M came running over. This time, the highest of the higher-ups came over as well. They pulled each of us aside and interrogated us, which was odd, then walked away and talked for like half an hour. They then fired the guy at the controls on the spot and came up with a BS reason to get the rest of us removed from running rides. They absolutely were only doing that to make an example of us. I tried to rip into M for shirking his duties, but as an anxiety-ridden kid, it didn't hit very hard. I was mainly pissed off that they fired the poor guy who never should have been there in the first place. Instead of addressing the real problem, M's absence, the dead radios, the poor staffing, they fired the most convenient person to make an example. Remember I took the already dead radios earlier? They tried to say I had removed communication devices from the ride area, which prevented them from letting controls know they were outside the gate. They were basically trying to pin the whole thing on me. Total bull, because this happened after I brought them back. I assume M threw me under the bus for being in charge while he wasn't there. Also, we had hand signals. I tried explaining that to them, but they didn't give a crap. I refused to sign the paperwork, which would be admitting fault, so the fight was stretched over multiple days. Plus, I was leaving for college in like 2 weeks and didn't want to spend my last days of summer cleaning bathrooms. They gave us a new rule. If a single radio was dying, we had to call a manager to fetch us a new battery, even if we had people to spare to go grab one instead. If a radio died, we had to close the ride. Managers roamed around the whole area and were responsible for so much, so if you called them and it wasn't urgent, it could take a long time for them to show up. The next day, my radio was dying. I called the manager. Half hour goes by. I call again. My radio died. I shut down the ride. The people in the over an hour line got pissed. I explained to the people we had to close because of the radios. Naturally, they got even more pissed because of how stupid that was. Manager shows up minutes later. I took the battery from him with a smile on my face, and he left without saying a word. After many complaints, management was magically fine with us using hand signals again. I never signed that paperwork. I left for college, and funny enough, M also went to the same college. I ran into him once. He just kind of nodded at me. I gave him a dirty look, and I never saw him again. The next summer, I was rehired by the park as a lead and actually did my damn job. And our second story. Store was drowning in unsellable candy. I took care of it quietly. Back in the early 90s, I was still figuring out adulthood, one questionable paycheck at a time. I worked at a grocery store in the Midwest whose name rhymes with Herbs. And yes, it was part of a larger chain owned by Kroger. I started on day shifts like everyone else, dealing with coupon arguments and people who treated a price check like a personal betrayal. After about 6 months, I got moved to overnight shifts, 11 to 7, sometimes 10 to 6, and that's when the job actually became tolerable. The store was quiet, the pace was steady, and most importantly, the general manager wasn't hovering around pretending to understand how a grocery store worked. One of the overnight checker's main responsibilities was restocking candy and snacks at all the checkout lanes. Sounds simple enough until you saw where the candy was stored. For reasons no one could adequately explain, it was piled into the stairwell that led up to the second floor office near the front of the store. Not neatly shelved, not labeled, just about 10 open cardboard boxes crammed into a narrow stairway like someone had given up halfway through organizing and decided chaos was a system. It was a fire hazard, a tripping hazard, and a logistical nightmare all rolled into one. To make things worse, the system, or lack of one, was held together by 3 different people who never seemed to talk to each other. The morning inventory lady counted what was on the shelves. The afternoon inventory lady was supposed to check what was in the stairwell but never actually did, and the daytime cashiers were meant to restock candy during slow periods. What they actually did was grab whatever was easiest to reach at the bottom of the pile, tear open new boxes, and scatter loose candy everywhere. Over time, each box became a mixed bag of random items, half-open packages, and stray pieces that didn't belong anywhere. Because I worked overnight, all of this somehow became my problem. The general manager, a guy who'd clearly been hired for his golf swing rather than his retail experience, started leaving notes attached to my time card. They all said roughly the same thing: organize candy stock or clean up stairwell. It was always written like he thought I was ignoring some simple task instead of dealing with a system that had been broken long before I got there. Every shift I'd restock what I could, but sorting that disaster properly would have taken hours we didn't have. And then there were the cherry nibs. Whoever was in charge of ordering had apparently found a deal and decided we needed enough nibs to supply a small country. The problem was no one actually bought them. They were everywhere. Full boxes, half boxes, loose bags lurking in every container like they'd multiplied overnight. You'd open a box expecting chocolate bars or gum and instead get greeted by another wave of those red, sticky little rejects. After a while, it felt personal. After about a dozen passive-aggressive notes in a month, I hit my limit. One night, I clocked in, looked at the stairwell, and decided I was done playing cleanup crew for a broken system. I told the night manager, who was actually a decent guy, I'm going to fix this mess for good. He shrugged and said, as long as the registers are stocked, do what you need to do. That was all the permission I needed. I pulled every single box out of that stairwell and lined them up on the floor. It took a while just to get everything down without spilling half of it everywhere. Then I started sorting. Chocolate in one group, gum in another, hard candy in a third, and so on. I labeled about 6 boxes clearly so anyone with basic reading skills could figure out what went where. It was tedious work, but by the time I was done, the chaos had turned into something resembling an actual system. That left the leftovers, the mountain of random, half-open, unsellable junk that'd been clogging everything up. especially the nibs. I stood there for a minute, looking at the pile, thinking about every note on my time card and every shift spent digging through that mess. Then I grabbed a cart, loaded it up with the junk candy and the trash I was already supposed to take out, and wheeled it to the back. The trash compactor sat there like an accomplice. I tossed the whole lot in, boxes, loose candy, and yes, about 90% of those cherry nibs. It had to be close to $1,000 worth of product, easy. I made sure to layer regular trash over the top so no one would notice a suspicious amount of crushed candy when they used it next. Wasn't exactly by the book, but neither was storing inventory in a stairwell. The next night, I walked in fully expecting to get pulled into the office and chewed out, or worse. Instead, I clocked in and found a note on my time card, same handwriting as before, but a very different tone. It said, "Good job organizing candy. Raise of 25 cents an hour effective next paycheck." I stood there for a second, reading it twice to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Turns out when the general manager saw a clean, organized system instead of a disaster, he assumed it had always been that simple. No questions about missing inventory, no investigation, just approval. The stairwell stayed organized after that, mostly because it was finally easy to maintain. Even the daytime crew started putting things back where they belonged, probably because they couldn't pretend it was too confusing anymore. And the nibs? For a while, they were mysteriously absent from our inventory. And our last story. Crazy Karen wants our house. When my wife and I got married, we made what most people would call a practical decision and what I would later describe as a character-building experience. She had a full ride and assistantship at a university in Mississippi, and walking away from that would have been financially insane. So I packed up my life, left my home state, and moved down with her. Luckily, her grandfather had a property sitting empty and offered to let us live there rent-free. The catch was that the place looked like it had been assembled by someone who got halfway through a DIY project and decided good enough was a lifestyle. The house sat deep in the woods, far enough off the main road that GPS occasionally gave up on it. The structure leaned just enough in places to make you question whether it was settling or slowly giving up. Doors didn't quite line up, the floors had opinions of their own, and the wiring was something I chose not to think too hard about. Still, free is free, and we made it work. We cleaned it up, patched what we could, and settled into a routine where I worked during the day while my wife's schedule shifted depending on classes and assistantship duties. Because of how remote the place was, we didn't get visitors, not the occasional neighbor, not delivery drivers, not even wrong turns. Anyone who showed up at that house either knew exactly where they were going or had made a very deliberate mistake. That's why one random afternoon when my wife was home alone and heard a car crunching down the gravel drive, her first reaction wasn't curiosity, it was caution. She looked out the window and saw a woman stepping out of the car, scanning the house like she was evaluating it. My wife later told me she considered grabbing her handgun for a second just in case, but the woman didn't look immediately threatening, so instead she waited for the knock and went to answer the door. "Can I help you?" my wife asked, keeping her tone polite but firm. The woman smiled like she was about to start a completely normal conversation. "Yes, I wanted to talk about renting this place for my daughter." My wife blinked, processing that sentence. "Oh, sorry, but my husband and I live here." The woman didn't miss a beat. "Well, my daughter's starting college and needs somewhere to stay." There was a pause, the kind where you expect the other person to realize what they just said doesn't make sense. It didn't happen. My wife tried again, a little more direct this time. "Right, but like I said, we live here. This isn't available." Instead of accepting that, the woman leaned slightly to the side, peering past my wife like she expected to see a leasing office in the hallway. "I was hoping to speak with your landlord. I know the owner." My wife's patience started to wear thin. Even if you do know him, that doesn't change anything. We're already living here. The woman's smile tightened into something sharper. "Young lady, I don't think you understand. I know him personally, and I'm sure he would be open to an arrangement." This is the moment entitlement reveals itself. The woman didn't ask if the house was available. She assumed it was because she wanted it to be. She dismissed the fact that people were clearly living there, and when told no, she tried to invoke a personal connection to override reality. At that point, my wife crossed her arms. "I understand perfectly. There is no arrangement. This house is occupied." That should have been the end of it, but apparently this woman had decided reality was optional. She drew herself up a little taller and said, "I'm sure he won't appreciate the way you're speaking to me." That was the moment my wife stopped trying to be polite. "I'm sure my grandfather won't care that I told you no." You could practically hear the record scratch. The woman's expression shifted from smug confidence to stunned confusion in about half a second. "Your grandfather," she repeated, like the concept itself offended her. "Yes," my wife said flatly, "the owner. The one you claim to know. This is his property and he's letting us live here. So no, your daughter's not moving in." The woman's face went through a whole range of emotions before settling on pure irritation. She huffed, spun around without another word, and marched back to her car. Gravel crunched again as she peeled out of the driveway like she'd just been personally wronged by the concept of occupancy. My wife stood there for a second, then shut the door and just stared at it. She told me later that it took a minute for the absurdity of the whole interaction to fully hit her. Someone had driven all the way out to a clearly lived-in house, knocked on the door, and tried to negotiate moving their kid in like we were temporary furniture. When I got home that evening, she told me the whole story while I was still halfway through taking off my boots. I just stood there, holding one boot in my hand, wondering how someone could be that confidently wrong about something so obvious. The next morning, my wife decided to make things a little clearer for any future visitors. She grabbed a sturdy note card, a marker, and wrote in big, unmistakable letters, "We are not and will not be renting. Management." She taped it right next to the doorbell where you couldn't miss it unless you were actively trying to. We figured that would be the end of it. Just a weird one-off encounter in a place where weird things apparently found us. A few days later, I was sitting outside fixing a section of fence when I heard a car slow down near the end of the drive. It didn't come all the way up this time. Instead, it just sat there for a moment. I glanced over and saw a driver leaning slightly out the window, squinting toward the house. After a few seconds, they shook their head and drove off. I walked back up to the porch and looked at the sign. It was still there, slightly crooked, but doing its job. My wife came out a minute later and asked what I was looking at. "Just thinking," I said, tapping the sign lightly. "We might need a bigger version." She laughed and shook her head. "If they can't read that one, a bigger sign isn't going to help." She wasn't wrong. Some people don't take a hint no matter how clearly it's written. Out of all three, the first story's easily the most satisfying. They tried to argue their way out of basic responsibility, doubled down on it, and then brought in someone who actually knew what they were talking about. They went from buy it yourself to installing alarms in every room like they were racing a deadline they didn't even know existed 5 minutes earlier. That kind of turnaround doesn't happen unless someone just explained very clearly how wrong they were. And honestly, that's what makes it so good. No yelling, no drama, just a quiet moment where reality caught up and they had no choice but to fix everything fast. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.